Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Chris Townsend, Vice President of Federal at Symantec.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully the morning sessions went well. I participated in a number of the breakout sessions. They were standing room only, great dialogue, great participation, and I want to thank you all for that. Hopefully everyone's enjoying lunch. Lunch okay? All right, excellent. Well, we've got a special treat for you this afternoon for our lunch keynote speaker. We have Principal Director at ODNI, Sue Gordon. And let me go through a little bit of Sue's background. So the Honorable Sue Gordon, Principal Deputy Director at ODNI, to the stage for discussion. She's coming up. With nearly 3 decades of experience in the intelligence community, Principal Deputy Director Gordon has served in a variety of leadership spanning numerous intelligence organizations and disciplines. In her current position, Deputy Director Gordon focuses on advancing intelligence integration across the intelligence community, expanding outreach and partnerships, and driving innovation. So I know we're all very much looking forward to hearing Director Gordon's keynote. So with that, Director Gordon. Thank you so much for coming. You're welcome.
How y'all doing? I am so happy to see you here. This is an important shared quest that we have, and just the size of this room suggests to me that we ought to be able to find our way. Hey, Jake. I recognize that I have the dreaded after lunch slot. So I'm going to try and be just a little bit interesting. And for any of you who fall asleep, let me give you a brief synopsis of my talk. A couple things. Cyber is not a threat we can view in isolation. There are threats that abound, and they are advancing at an alarming rate. You in cybersecurity are not a commodity. You're an essential part of the fabric of national security. This moment demands partnership both across the government, but with the private sector, and there is a large portion of it that is on you. I would say that I'm a steely-eyed intelligence officer who has spent a long time in this business, and a lot of the work of national security was considered government work. National security is our collective responsibility. And if the private sector doesn't recognize that it is part of that responsibility, in addition to the responsibility it has to its shareholders, we're going to have a hard day. And then the last point I'm going to make is that we have come so far together in a very short time. I've been at cyber for probably the past 10, 12 years. I have never seen more effort going into collective solution than I have today. But I will also tell you I'm sick and tired of us talking about it. If I see one more presentation in front of the Congress that does some problem identifying while we sit here talking about what needs to be done, I might lose my mind. This is important enough for us to get on with it. Would you all agree? And the most important thing is we have to figure out how we're going to trust each other. And we're going to have to figure out how we understand each other's shared imperatives and value propositions so we can find that space, rather than me asking you all to do things for me or you asking me to provide things to you. That is not the way this is going to work, so let's get on with it together. Listen, here's the deal. From a threat landscape perspective, I would say that not only do threats abound, but they're, if anything, advancing and perhaps even morphing. It seems like 2 minutes ago that we had as a nation tremendous advantage in our use of the digital environment. And about a minute ago, even though there were cyber actors at play, they were, with a couple of exceptions, I'm going to say almost simplistic in how they were using it. It was either for the purpose of intrusion, let me go in someplace and see what's going on, and perhaps even stealing information, or denial of service. And we thought that someplace in the distance there might come that time where cyber was integrated into national interests, and or what we saw going on in the digital environment were the much more nefarious sorts of behaviors like data manipulation, data denial, and even the use of the digital environment in order to achieve physical effect. That really and truly, yesterday it seemed we were talking about that was something that might happen, and it's happening. And it's happening more with, we expected it from Russia because they are a big, experienced, integrated nation who has multidisciplinary capabilities that they can use. But now you see nations like North Korea, Iran being able to do these sorts of integrated, effective activities. And so it's kind of, the time is right for us to be able to do something about it. The other thing I will tell you is we can't look at cyber actions just as a technical vulnerability. One of the ways to think about it is every aspect of national interest is going to be affected through the digital environment. And one of the things we've done over the years is we've kind of thought technology to technology. That's not the way it's being affected by our adversaries, and it can't be the way that we imagine of protecting against it going forward. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. As we near the end of 2017, which is a shocking statement in and of itself, it's been another year of botnets and malware outbreaks and cybercrime and big data breaches. We've had another consecutive year of cyber attacks against multiple industrial sectors and critical infrastructure. Not only here, but in Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, we've experienced a constant stream of hacks and disclosures of hacked information. Obviously, we've seen the digital environment being used in a way that was aimed at influencing elections in ways that have, I think, mercifully caught our attention. Because in a way, until we saw this activity of influence, it's like we thought that a cyber attack was really going to be something like the Eastern Seaboard going down, rather than something that could be used in combination to erode our confidence in ourselves. And so you see the sophistication going in, so it demands even more of our attention. And one of the reasons why this advance in what cyber actors are doing is important is because at the exact same time our reliance on the digital environment has grown exponentially. It's an essential part of every single thing we do. It shapes how industries operate, how businesses profit, and how nations govern. And information has grown as essential as electricity. The first few billion Internet of Things devices are already in place, and household appliances are as likely to have a network connection as a power cord. And so the effect one can have, an adversary can have on us, whether advertently or inadvertently, is just amplified because of our growing dependence on this. And if that weren't enough, now nations are looking to use the digital environment to affect the world just like they might use economic tools or military or diplomacy, and they're using cyber in combination. So example, when you see cyber attacks trying to cause power blackouts in Ukraine, you're probably also going to see tanks massing at the border. And so I just want to put that in context because too often we each think we're doing what we're doing and we forget that we're all in the business of ensuring our interests. And we talk a lot about what the government's responsibility in security is. One of the aspects of government security has always been to allow a free and open society so that we could advance at the rate that we could. Now what in this environment is the responsibility of the government with the private sector, even allowing that that's still there, and we need your help in understanding that. allowing that cyber is just one capability in broader strategies to advance national interests, we kind of have to think about a framework so we understand what's going on. I think we have to understand the intent behind activities, to understand what's going on intentionally and what's trying to be affected rather than just what we're seeing. And part of the reason why I think we have to understand this framework and be able to share it with you all is we have to be able to distinguish between a nuisance and an existential threat. There have to be a set of things that we can allow to go on without feeling like we're about to lose our nationality and our national interests. And so I think that one of the reasons why it's so important for us to understand the intent behind it is we need to be able to share that so we as a collective to decide how far we're going to go in order to stop it. So neat, I've now just done what I said I hate, and that is I've been another person standing up here and describing the problem. So let's talk about what we're going to do about it. I said we had a shared responsibility to protect the digital environment. We absolutely do. And both of us have the responsibility to identify and defend against threats. But we have different capabilities that we can employ to carry out these responsibilities. We ought to use what we each have first independently and then in combination. On the government side, we actually have two advantages. One of them is in using our intelligence capabilities to understand cyber operations. And try to determine an actor's capabilities and intent. Because we have established broad reach over the course of our history, we have the ability to see the world from a really unique perspective. We get to see activities in combination. And we have 60 plus years of analytic tradecraft to apply to this particular craft of what we see going on digitally. And we can put that those activities in a broader security context. The other thing that we have going for us on the government side, and we ought to do this a lot better than we already do, and that is we should use the partnership between the agencies. So I'm a career CIA officer, relatively new to this notion of community when I went to NGA and now into the ODNI. And at my hearing, I said that the ODNI was an essential element of the community, and for a former CIA officer to say those words may seem shocking, and I was not just pandering to the community to get the job, I believe it. I believe it because we have two really vital functions. One is to be able to bring the whole of the community to capability to bear on any national problem. The second, if we act together, we can clear the way for good things to happen. If I look at why people think differently about the ODNI today than they might have at its inception, I think one of the reasons is who the makeup of the community is. When the FBI and the DHS became a part of the intelligence community, we now have the wherewithal to partner together to not only just see things, but also to act in places that were outside of our reach. I think we need to keep on working together to make sure that the government has its act together in terms of how we work and interact and share with the private sector. So it's not just what we each independently know or the intelligence community has in terms of our understanding of what the threats are, it's what we can put together in terms of understanding what's going on domestically in order to be able to share it with you. As I said, we have an obligation to share. The intelligence community is not the arm that typically interacts with the private sector. That really is the DHF and the FBI. But one of the obligations I feel is we need to produce information with increasing fidelity so that you know what to do about it. We're really proud of the fact that we share broad threats much more quickly than we used to, and in fact some specific threats more clearly. But still, if it's something that is just an abstraction, if I am a CEO of a company trying to decide what I'm going to do about it, and how I am going to engage the cybersecurity community, I need a little more specificity depending on how far I want to go. So I think we have to keep pushing the specificity with which we offer our threat information. A lot of burden on the federal government, and because I'm there, I feel disproportionately that responsibility. Context, big responsibility. Content, big responsibility to know what's going on. Attribution, huge responsibility that I feel. Okay, now, private sector and your community, the cybersecurity community in specific. One One, you're much bigger than we are in terms of the number of nodes that are potential attack vectors. And you have much better awareness of what's going on inside your networks. You have a really interesting collective fence catching a lot of activities that you're seeing that we don't necessarily. There's a whole, in different venues, there's this whole privacy, national security conversation going on. And if you want to know who cares the most about the privacy, who do you think it is? It's the federal government. Every one of our employees swore to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And part of that is privacy, and we believe in it. And so this barrier is a barrier that we believe in. But we know that the private sector has data that's be useful in combination with the things that we see. Number one, it's incredibly more voluminous. And two, it's much more specific. And it's not just sharing with the federal government, it's sharing with each other. You know, I once had a conversation with a colleague at NSA, and we're like, you know, if we would share information on what's happening to our networks and how we're being probed, we would be able to distinguish between truly spurious activity or infrequently occurring activity that is occurring to both of us. If you think about the private sector across the board in terms of all the things that you're detecting, if we could put that together, it would be pretty magical in terms of what we would be able to see. And what's interesting in combination with artificial intelligence and automation, those behaviors, those patterns, those things we're seeing could be really easily turned into activity that a human isn't going to typically pick up. One of the glue lines I usually use is it's really hard to detect massing at the border in cyberspace. But I do believe if we had enough information, we could find the patterns that would show that. Because these things happening to us are not random. They may be difficult to distinguish, but they are not. It's a perfect use of some of the new emergent analytic capabilities on what we do, but only if we have the relatively larger data sets that I think exist between the two of us. And it's not just what's happening in our networks, it's protecting our supply chains. There are days when I try to describe what the role of the intelligence community is, and it's, you know, some days I use to know the truth, see beyond the horizon, and allow action before events dictate. I think that's a pretty good one and pretty relevant. There are others when I say it's to relentlessly pursue unfair advantage in the context of our adversaries' capabilities. And I like that a lot because it's advantage, right? It's just not an abstraction. It's put in motion. Sometimes I think it's, if it's knowable and if it's important, we ought to know it. Because that's what the rest of the world is using. And what's interesting about this information game, being able to see the world and its patterns, is the one that actually gets there first in terms of understanding does get all the marbles. If we don't find a way to put our data together in order to be able to see that, we're going to have a hard time succeeding nationally, as well as succeeding each individually. But the supply chain is another piece of it. How do we trust the code and the hardware that are putting into our systems? How do we ensure that it has a good pedigree? And even if we didn't exist in the national security framework, I opine that you care about that. You care about that from an intellectual property perspective. You care about that from a competition perspective. So even if you don't have to care about what I care about, I'm saying that the protection and the security of our systems and our information is, in fact, as much in your interest as it is in mine. So how do we come together to think about the supply chain to make sure that what we have, we can protect, even if we're protecting for very different reasons? I think there's a shared interest there. Here's some joint actions I think we can do. We continue to see the outbreak of malware on the internet, ransomware that spreads automatically and indiscriminately, even to hospitals or companies. When these things happen, we come together exceptionally well. Certainly with the help from the government to mitigate the immediate issues, but but I can envision an outbreak in which the government has to be prepared to act quickly alongside with our industry partners to contain something that could have serious impact. Not after the fact to try and figure out who did it or what to clean up, but we actually recognize it as it's going on, and kind of seamlessly we come together because we know the mechanisms by which we must share it, and we trust each other to not misuse the information that either one presents. There are models for partnerships that have been effective. I think the work that was done to contain WannaCry was really good. If you just think about the time frame in which we collectively responded to that, I could name it in days. And ones before that either weren't attended to until we had massive losses, or it was a much longer time frame. What you can most do for us is to think about what you need. Right? We have had lots of proposals and we have lots of asks, and we can see the world really clearly. I think you see the same world, but we're each almost trying to protect it from our own vantage point. What do you need from the government in order to trust us with your data? Would we, okay, show of hands. This is the participation part to make sure that you're not nodding off. Who thinks that as a collective, we have data that if prosecuted would be useful to understand what's happening to us and then be able to mount a response? Raise your hand if you think that between the two of us, we have something. Raise your hand if you think that either one of us can do it alone. Okay, I like this participation phase. Raise your hand if you're worried. Come on. Oh, and by the way, I'm talking to you about the things that I need from you. Listen, I get it. We are really protective of sources and methods. We are really protective of advantage, and we are really protective of partners' data and partners' capabilities, and that is really hard for us to share enough information, but you all too. Mostly what we need to do is to figure out what we absolutely must have from the other side. Share that information, and then I cannot believe that the nation that has done so many huge things in my short lifetime cannot figure this one out. Jim Comey went, I know, you're like, oh, she said his name. Jim Comey gave a great talk on security and privacy. And what he said is he refuses to believe that we are not good enough to be able to put an and in there, or to, as a collective, figure out how we're going to protect both, because they're both massively important. As I said, I think the government has always viewed one of its responsibilities to protect private interests. When I think about the advantage that our nation has over so many of our adversaries, it is exactly that freedom and that ability to innovate without constraint, and the ability to pursue without somebody checking to make sure that your pursuit is worthy. That is really important. Surely we can find a way to protect that and be able to find a way to protect our national interests, because 90% of our exposure points are not inside the federal government. Maybe we could start with something simple like just computer hygiene. Maybe we could just start with something simple like underwriters' labs, so people would know whether a solution being proffered meets our standards. Maybe that would be great for consumers if we had to hold ourselves accountable when we hold their information. There have got to be ways. I promise you that we are working hard to be able to share the perspective that the intelligence community in the U.S. government has on these threats. Each year we have the annual threat assessment that comes out of the intelligence community. It's unclassified for a reason. If you look back over the last 5 years, it has disproportionately talked about cyber, and if you look at it, it's increasing specificity. The partnerships we're building amongst agencies are better than I've seen, even though we still don't totally know how to work with each other. What you are doing independently, think about how much work Symantec, FireEye, Mandiant before it have contributed to our understanding of these things. This is a public-private thing, but we're each pursuing it here. I enjoin us to come together. And it's mostly our data that needs to play with each other in order to be able to find the patterns that we can't see just by doing it alone. I wanted to come here today because I feel such affection for this community because of the partnerships that you have effected over the past several years, and that I consider what you're doing as a front line of our freedoms. But I worry when I see advancing threats, when I see adversaries that have whole of country, not only whole of government solutions, that we might be missing some opportunities when we don't work together. I'll tell you, I promise you the government will come to the table in terms of these conversations about public-private partnership on this front. I don't write all my own talking points, so you can trust me that if I'm saying these words, they come with the commitment of the organizations that are behind me. It's important work that you're engaged in. It's important work that we're engaged in. There has to be a way to do an and. I mean, I think I'm looking at the people who can participate. If we'll just remember that while we each has to come with our own perspective, the magic is not in slamming it together whole, but is imagining that piece that we can create new between the two of us. I look forward to it. I can't wait to see what you do with the rest of the day. You can usually find me, and so if you want to throw a red flag on any of the things I've said, you may. I promise you, and if you come up with ideas and you can't get a government participating in those conversations, you can call me up and I will make sure that that happens. Important moment. We have got to get on our front foot, and it requires all of us. Thank you so very much.